The medieval work I most frequently get asked questions about is without a doubt the Canterbury Tales, which is as well known as Beowulf but much less understood, and that's not saying much because most people don't understand Beowulf either. But this is a real shame, and I think a reflection of a growing phenomenon in a society with mass liberal arts education, which is that most people in the English-speaking world know that there is a book called the Canterbury Tales. Maybe they read selections from it in school. They know it's considered a great work, maybe one of the most important works in human history. It's worth reading, it's worth studying, but they have no idea why. That's the number one question I'm going to answer today. We'll talk a bit about what the Canterbury Tales are, the conditions that produce them. I'll give my recommendation on how to read them, but the most important thing I'm going to try to demonstrate today is why are they good? Why are they worth reading? How does Chaucer, using a variety of different voices which range from hilarious to awe-inspiring, treat with the most important questions of the human experience? What makes this one of the best things ever written? Stay tuned. Geoffrey Chaucer, a poet of great fame even in his living years, died in the year 1400, at only 58 years old, and not quite all the way through his magnum opus, titled The Book of the Tales of Canterbury, more colloquially known as the Canterbury Tales. It's unclear exactly how finished this work is. Some people say that it's very incomplete, less than halfway done. Others say that Chaucer changed his mind on how long it was going to be, and that it's really only missing a few intermediate pieces. It's definitely up for debate. I won't get too far into it here, but we do have a beginning, we do have an end, and we do have a substantial body of poetry that can be analyzed rather well in a linear fashion. So I think we can take the Canterbury Tales as an almost finished work, regardless of whether or not it was all that Chaucer had originally intended. What we have of the work is 10 disconnected fragments that we can probably order in the way Chaucer had planned on, and across those 10 fragments are 24 tales told by probably fictional pilgrims who are, along with Chaucer himself, on a probably fictional pilgrimage to Canterbury. This pilgrimage might have actually happened, but the cast of characters is such an efficiently diverse representation of English social classes in the sort of estate satire tradition that it seems a bit too convenient that they were all really there. Either way, to what extent it's real is really completely impossible to say, so it's not worth getting into. The tales begin by Chaucer telling us that he met all of these people at the Tabard, a famous inn in Southwark in London, and that he agreed to go on their pilgrimage to the shrine of St. Thomas in Canterbury Cathedral. The innkeeper of the tavern, named Harry Bailey, but generally referred to as the host, goes on the pilgrimage as well, serving as a sort of leader of the group. The host suggests early on that to stave off boredom, every person in the group should take turns telling a story, 2 stories per person, so we would expect about 60 stories total. Of this expected 60, Chaucer writes 24, the 24 stories of the Canterbury Tales. This isn't just a collection of stories, though. Chaucer regularly reminds you what's going on. There is a frame narrative, and the flow of the work is generally that the host will pick someone to tell the next story, that person will give a brief introduction, then they will tell their story, and then after their story, the characters will all react to it, vividly interacting with each other. A good example of this is when the man of law, that is the lawyer of the group, tells an entertaining and moralizing story about a fictional pseudo-saint named Custance, and afterwards the host is delighted and says, "This was a thrifty tale for the nonnes," that is, that was great. He then asks one of the priests in the group to tell the next tale, with his reasoning being that it seems well-learned people can tell good tales. In his request, though, he swears twice, saying "for God's bonus," for God's bones, and "be God's dignité," by God's dignity. Instead of responding to the host's request, the priest gets mad, saying, "Benedicte, what aileth the man so sinfully to sweare?" That is, bless you, what's wrong with you that you're so sinfully swearing? And then the host gets mad, curses some more, perhaps sarcastically tells the priest to give a sermon or something, and then the sailor in the group interrupts and says, "No, we're not going to hear a sermon or some boring tale about philosophy again. I'm going to tell you a good story now." And then he tells a really scandalous tale about a woman who cheats on her husband with a monk. This kind of interaction and struggle between stories about heavenly matters, which lift you up, and stories about earthly matters, which comparatively drag you down, is a real characterizing theme of the Canterbury Tales, and is best seen in the first fragment when the stories begin. The first tale is told by the highest-ranking member of the group, who is a knight, and he tells arguably the best and most impressive tale in the whole work, an extremely artistic Middle English version of Boccaccio's Teseida, which is a story of two brothers, Palamon and Arcite, and their love for Emily, the daughter of Theseus. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's a really beautiful poem, a love story which borrows heavily in its moralization from Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, but also Aristotelian metaphysics and medieval cosmology, and at the end of the poem, Theseus mentions some of these themes explicitly, and exhorts the reader to live a good life. Following the knight's tale, the host attempts to start working down the social ladder and offers the monk the chance to tell a tale. But the miller drunkenly interrupts, argues a bit with the host and the reeve, and then demands to tell his own tale, which turns out to be a rowdy, scandalous story about an idiot carpenter who gets tricked into thinking a second great flood is coming by his adulterous wife's other lover. He builds a boat in the attic, and chaos ensues, leaving every character looking like an absolute idiot, but most especially the carpenter. The reeve of the group, which is basically like an estate manager, used to be a carpenter, and takes great offense to the miller's tale. He tells his own tale next, about two boys who show up at a miller's house. One of them sleeps with his daughter, the other sexually assaults his wife, both of them physically assault the miller, and then they run away with his grain. The cook of the group laughs at this tale, immediately follows with his own, which starts talking about a prostitute, and then abruptly ends. Some people think Chaucer just never got around to finishing this story, but I think his intention here was that a higher-ranking character interrupts and puts an end to the spiral that the stories have been taking. That is, we started with the Knight's Tale, a really high and noble love story. That was followed by the Miller's Tale, an adulterous and scandalous love story. That was followed by the Reeve's Tale, a story where there is really not much love at all, and the two relationships that occur are characterized more by manipulation and violence. And then at the end we have the Cook's Tale, which seems to be about to present love as something that you can buy and sell. And at this point the nobility of the group has had enough and puts an end to the tale before it can even begin. That's fragment 1 anyway, and each of the 10 fragments do seem to have, to varying degrees, an individual thrust, which reflects our assumption that Chaucer probably composed them in bursts at a time, intending eventually to stitch them all together, which he never got around to doing. There's too much to talk about with the Canterbury Tales, and even in a semester-long course, we wouldn't be able to cover everything. If I want to convince you that this is worth reading, however, I will cover 3 more important aspects of the work: Chaucer's sense of humor, his skill as a poet, and the overall moral of the story. First, his sense of humor. Chaucer is one of the best comedic poets of all time, and in particular his use of irony is masterful. We see this in various forms. Take a look at the general prologue, for example, where he describes every pilgrim on the journey. Some of these descriptions are very straightforward, like that of the squire, the knight's son. Chaucer describes him as young, handsome, cheery, and well-mannered. Not really anything else there. Compare that to the description of the monk, who we're told is an enterprising man of the New World, which we see actually means that he doesn't follow the rule of St. Benedict and spends all his time hunting with his greyhounds. Chaucer doesn't just say, yeah, he's corrupt. He pretends that the monk is fighting some sort of righteous battle against the unreasonable demands of monastic life. Here's what he has to say. He yaff not of that text a pulled hen that saith that hunters bait not holy men. Nay, that a monk, whan he is wretcheless, is likened till a fish that is waterless. This is to sign a monk out of his cloistre, but thilke text held he not worth an oystre. On the side his opinion was good. What should he studie, and make himself in wode, upon a book in cloistre alway to pore, or swinking with his hondes on labore, as Austin beat? Who shall the world be served? Let Austin have his swink to him reserved. In ironically agreeing with the monk, Chaucer is adopting here the voice of Chaucer the Pilgrim, not Chaucer the poet-philosopher, and Chaucer the Pilgrim is extremely naive and gullible. There are several instances where Chaucer the Pilgrim remarks at a corrupt member of the clergy, notably also the prioress and the pardoner, and highlights only their positive qualities, saying, wow, that prioress is dressed really well, or wow, that pardoner is really good at making money, which allows the audience to read in between the lines. The prioress isn't practicing her vow of poverty. The pardoner is a corrupt extortionist. Nowhere, however, does Chaucer use his ironic pilgrim voice in a funnier way than when it's his turn to tell a tale. The host makes fun of him, pretty well actually, and then calls on him to give his story, to which Chaucer sheepishly says that he only knows one rhyme that he learned a long time ago. He then proceeds to tell the tale of Sir Topas, which, I have to tell you, is one of the worst poems ever written. I'm not even going to give you an example. It's practically unreadable. Halfway through this tale, the host interrupts Chaucer, saying, "Na more of this, for God's dignity," no more of this, for God's dignity, and complains that Chaucer is exhausting him with how bad the poem is. Chaucer protests, saying that this is the best tale he knows. I'm sure I don't have to spell it out for you how funny it is that Chaucer, the guy who wrote the whole work, has his own character give the worst poem and then complain that he doesn't know a better one in the middle of an anthology of his own poetry. It's really obvious that Chaucer thinks about the differences between good poetry and bad poetry, and he makes fun of this difference not only with his own character, but with the character of the squire. His father, the knight, gives the first tale and the best tale. The squire, who goes much later, clearly attempts to give a tale of even greater quality and greater scope, an epic Arthurian romance set in the court of Genghis Khan. Early on, however, it becomes apparent that while he is demonstrating a lot of artistic flourish, the squire is completely out of his depth, and has attempted a story that is way too long and way too ambitious for this setting. It takes confusing diversions, introduces subplots randomly, seems to have no intent of producing a followable narrative, and about 600 lines in, the squire gives a list of all the things he's going to cover in the story, which some scholars estimate would have been longer than the rest of the Canterbury Tales combined. He then begins the next part with these lines. Apollo whirleth up his char so hie, till that the god Mercurius host the slee. And then he's interrupted. Why here? The squire is attempting to use the literary concept we call the sublime, in Greek hypsos, which is where you elevate the reader and lift their attention out of a certain focus into a more contemplative state. Here we are departing worldly affairs to hear about the affairs of the gods, which were associated in medieval literature with philosophy, cosmology, and theology. The sublime has been described as something which takes you to high places to think about these things. It makes you forget about who you are. I think it's best understood as something that gives you chills, or takes your breath away. Chaucer employs it really well at the end of Troilus and Cressida, where the main character dies in a really horrible fight, but then his spirit ascends into heaven and looks down at the earth, laughing at how small and vain it is. This is what the squire is trying to do. But the sublime is a really tricky device to pull off, and if you fail, you can end up nauseating your audience. When the squire begins this part by saying that Apollo whirls up his chariot, instead of the gentle ascent of Troilus into the heavens, we get a sort of dizzying sensation, where our attention is uncomfortably ripped out from under us and brought into the sky. At this point, the franklin, not a nobleman but not a serf either, and probably a friend of the household, politely interrupts the squire, saying, "Wow, that was a really great tale. You have shown yourself to be an excellent storyteller." And then the host, seeing what he's doing, then immediately says, "All right, well, you, Franklin, why don't you tell a story now?" before the squire has a chance to say, "Wait, I still had 20,000 lines left." I do want to talk directly about Chaucer's actual poetic skill, which is on full display throughout the entire work. The Canterbury Tales is around 17,000 lines of poetry, mostly in loose decasyllabic rhyming couplets, which is the predecessor to iambic pentameter. Here's the opening prologue to give you the most famous example of how this meter works. Juan that April with his surest sorter the drocht of March hath persed to the rota, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath, the tendre croppus, and the youngest son hath in the rames halve course runne. On small foles maken melodie, that slepen al the nicht with open eie, so pricketh hem naturen hier courages. Than longen folk to goon on pilgrimages, und palmeris for to seken stronges strondes, to ferne haules, couthen sondre londes. On specially from every sheeres ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to seke, that hem hath holpen Juan that they were seke. As you can see, some lines are actually 9 syllables, some 11, and it really matters more that there are 5 stressed positions as opposed to 5 iambs, which is what we get with Shakespeare. Here we see a master using the artistic tools that he will later write the squire and his own character to abuse. We begin with April and March, and Zephyrus, and the sun, and Aries. These things come down from their heavenly, celestial spaces into our earthly lives in tangible things like roots and flowers and crops and birds. And in the backdrop of this natural renewal of April, we arrive at human affairs. What are the people doing? Well, they're going on pilgrimages of Thanksgiving. happy that they made it out of the sickness and the cold and the general trials of winter. One of the more impressive moments of the Canterbury Tales is when Chaucer writes in what's called rhyme royale, a significantly more challenging meter of 7-line stanzas arranged in an A, B, A, B, B, C, C rhyme scheme. Here's one of my favorites for an example in the second nun's prologue when she invokes Mary. Assembled is in the magnificence, with mercy, goodness, and with sweet pity, that thou that art the Son of excellence, not only helpest him that pray in thee, but oftentime of thee benignity, full freely, ere that men thine help beseche, thou goest beforn, and art here levis lege. The nun goes on to tell the story of Saint Cecilia in these stanzas, and it's a really beautiful tale, one of the best. As the Canterbury Tales draw to a close, not only does the pilgrimage draw closer to Canterbury itself, but the sun begins to set, and we start to get a sort of subdued end to the whole thing. The host notices the setting sun, and says that only one person has yet to give their tale, implying that Chaucer intended to insert all of the ones that he never got around to writing in between the ones we already have. The one remaining tale-teller happens to be the priest that the host swore at earlier, and this time around he politely asks him to finish them off with a fable. The priest protests, saying that made-up stories are sinful, but agrees instead to give a sermon, to which the host also consents. The Canterbury Tales end, therefore, with Chaucer essentially writing a long homily through the mouth of his priest character, which warns of sin and preaches the virtue of confession and a holy life. What meaning do we get, then, from a long list of tales which treat variably with every different kind of story known to the medieval Englishman, sometimes noble, sometimes base, sometimes moral, sometimes comic, sometimes holy, sometimes sinful, but then to end the pilgrimage and the day with self-reflection, compunction, and confession? Chaucer actually writes what he calls a retraction at the end, a retraction, where he apologizes for anything sinful or vain that he wrote, quotes the Bible a few times, and asks the reader to pray for him, which I find rather moving. It's almost like a child saying their prayers at nighttime, or someone confessing on a deathbed. The end of the Canterbury Tales is the death of the Canterbury Tales. The pilgrims on the journey are pilgrims through life, going from birth to death, from another world to another world. He writes in the beginning, "And pilgrimes were thaiale," and pilgrims were they all. If you know the Canterbury Tales well, you might notice that even after all of this, I haven't mentioned some of the best parts, be it big picture like the Wife of Bath or the Pardoner's Tale, or small details like the summoner pretending he can speak Latin by babbling a few phrases he knows. There's just so much to read. If you want to read it yourself, I have a few different recommendations. For people who don't really care about the Middle English, Penguin has a pretty good modern English edition. For people who want the Middle English text, I recommend trying to get a hold of a Boning and Taylor edition. This is what I used as a student. It's got glosses for some of the less familiar words, which I really appreciated. If you really love Chaucer and you want to get a good edition of his full life works, check out the Riverside Chaucer, which is a fantastic anthology with glosses and whatnot. I love this book. I have the paperback and the hardcover, and together they weigh about 50 pounds, not for the faint of heart. If you want any of these books, all of the links will be in the description. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you like content like this, check out the rest of the channel. Kindly consider subscribing or becoming a supporter on Patreon. And until next time, Farathye Yesunde.